Welcome to Novaworks Learning Center. In part 2 of the simple financial statement tagging tutorial, we'll show how to tag parenthetical data, demonstrate adding calculations, and go over how to tag footnotes. Let's dive right in. In the previous tutorial, we tagged the rows and columns of a simple balance sheet, which I have open in GoFiler. We tagged all the rows and both of the columns for the table. We also used the block fact tool to individually tag the data for different classes of stock. So next, we'll talk about parenthetical data. Numeric data in the stub of financial tables must be disclosed separately when filing XBRL to the SEC. That data will be included in a separate presentation called a parenthetical presentation. We have in our table 3 rows that include parenthetical data: the row with our preferred stock value, the row with the Class A common stock value, and the row with the Class B common stock value. These rows have values for authorized shares, issued shares, outstanding shares, and the par value of the stock, each of which must be tagged. Now, we don't need to do anything to signify that this is parenthetical data. The software is going to make that determination for us when it generates our XBRL or inline XBRL report based on the use of the inline XDX tagging inside the table. So let's begin by selecting our first fact. This is the par value of the preferred stock. We want to select only the number without the $sign. We'll use the inline fact tool to tag this data. Click Inline Fact. This is very similar to the block tagging tool. Set the element. And now, we're going to set the label. We could also set the label using the inline label tool, but using the dialog makes more sense for this type of information. The structure of the language in the stub isn't ideal for tagging labels. I'm going to set this label to Preferred Stock Par Value. Click Next. Now set the context for the information. We'll enter the first date, which is March 31st, 2019. Click Next. Before we click Finish, we need to specify that this value is used for more facts. There is a second context for the par value, so we have to tag the value again for that context. So click this option, and then press Finish. The dialog opens again. The element and label are already set. Click Next. Set the context to the second context in the table, which is December 31st, 2018. Click Next. This is the last fact we need to create for this value, so we'll leave this option unchecked and click Finish. The par value is tagged. Now we can tag the first value for authorized shares. Select the number. Click Inline Fact. Set the element. Choose a label. Click Next. Set the context. If we read the stub, this value applies only to the March 31st context, so select that one. Click Next, and click Finish. Next is the value for shares issued. Select the text for No. This data represents the fact value for the issued shares. Click Inline Fact. Set the element for the fact. This is the Preferred Stock Shares Issued element. To transform the word No into a numerical value for this element, we will use a transformation. To do this, click the Advanced button. Check the option to use special processing for zeros. And then set the option to interpret No as 0. This will specify an appropriate transformation to use for the fact data. Click OK. Now we'll add the label for this element. And click Next. The context for this value is the same as for the authorized shares. Click Next. If we stop here and look at the text, We can see that this value also represents the shares outstanding, so let's check this option and tag it again. Click Finish. The dialog opens again. This time we want to change the element. Choose the new element. If we click the Advanced button, we can see that the transformation options we chose are already set. Click OK. Set the new label for the element. Click Next. Check the context. Click Next. And click Finish. Now we can tag the second value for shares authorized, issued, and outstanding. Select the text for the second No in the stub. This is the value for the shares authorized, issued, and outstanding as of December 31st. Click Inline Fact. Set the element. We can choose an element we've previously used by clicking on the drop-down list. Recently selected elements are available in this list. We need to click the Advanced button again and set the transformation, so let's do that. Click OK. Set the label. Click Next, and set the context to the December context. Click Next. This value is used again, so check this option, and click Finish. Set the element to the element for issued shares. The transformation is already set, so we don't need to set any advanced options. Set the label. Then click Next. Click Next again. And this value is used one more time for the outstanding shares, so check this option again. Set the element. Set the label. Click Next. And click Next again. And finally, Finish. We'll repeat this process for the two classes of common stock. Select the par value without the $sign. Click Inline Fact. Set the element and label. Click Next. Set the context. This is another fact that is being reported for more than one context, so we'll start with the March context. This context will also use the statement class of stock axis. We previously made this context when we block tagged the value for the common stock, so we can select that context from the context library. Click OK. Click Next, and then set the option to run the tagging tool again. And click Finish. Repeat the process for the December context. We're going to continue tagging the values for the common stock. We will tag the shares authorized, and then double tag the value for the shares issued and outstanding. For the second context, we're going to select the word No, and use that as the value for all three elements. Once the Class A common stock is complete, we can move on to the Class B common stock. The process for these items is the same. We will use the context with the Class B common stock member. Now that we've completed the common stock items, all the information for the parenthetical disclosure has been tagged. The next step is to add the calculations to the table. There are two ways to do this. The fastest way is to create a calculation automatically using the Create Calculation tool. So let's start with the calculation for total current assets. First, identify the items to be included in the calculation. We're going to select them using the Row Selection tool. Place the mouse to the left of the row for the first calculation until the pointer becomes a right arrow. Then click to select the row. Holding down the Shift key, click on each row to add to the calculation. If you click on the total row, it will select all the rows between the starting row and the total. When all the rows are in the selection, click the Calculation button. A dialog appears with the information about the calculation that was created. The calculation ID for the total current assets is listed here. This ID is used to identify each element that is part of the calculation. The rest of the log tells you what elements were processed and whether or not they were added or subtracted. Click OK. When we click on one of these rows now, we can look at the management view to see the calculation. So let's add the calculation for the total assets now. Select the components for the calculation. Click the Calculation button. We'll do the same for the liabilities. The stockholders' equity for this example is a little different. We have items in the stockholders' equity that are dimensionalized because we have two different classes of common stock. You can't add components with a dimension to a total that has no dimension. This is a limitation of XBRL. We can't just add the calculation like we did with the other examples. For this item, let's select the non-dimensional components of the calculation. You can skip over rows by holding the Control key as you click. Rows can be selected and deselected with the Control key, just like you can in any other list. Just click on it and it'll toggle on or off. and then we'll click the Calculation button to create the calculation. Now, place the cursor inside one of the block tag items for the common stock value element. Then click the arrow below the Calculation button to open the Calculation menu, and select the Calculation Editor menu item. This tool is going to let us add the common stock value element to our calculation, so our report will disclose the appropriate relationships between the elements. Because we don't disclose the total value of our different common stock, we'll get a warning about our calculation not adding up when we make our XBRL report, but the underlying calculation will be correct. First, click the Load Used button to load all the calculations in the report into the dialog. If you're running the software version 5.1c or later, you do not have to click on the Load Used button. The dialog will automatically load the calculations when it is opened. Then use the identifier list to find the calculation for the stockholders' equity. Now we're going to select Adds into the total because this is a debit item that is being added into a debit item. Click Add, and then click OK to set the calculation information. Finally, we can add the calculations for the total liabilities and stockholders' equity. Select the Total Liabilities row. Hold the Control key and click on the Total Shareholders Deficit row and the Total Liabilities and Stockholders Deficit row to add them both to the selection. Click the Calculation button to create the calculation. We've now added all the calculations for this statement. If you make a mistake, you can use the Calculation Editor to adjust the calculations. Remember that you're editing how an element participates in calculations with this tool and not the entire calculation. So you must place the cursor on the row that contains the n-gram you want to adjust, and then open the Calculation Editor dialog. Finally, I'm going to show you how to tag a footnote. This sample document doesn't have a footnote on the balance sheet, so I'm going to open another sample in GoFiler. I've already tagged this balance sheet. You can see that there's a footnote that applies to the common stock value row. First, let's tag the row with the reference. Place the cursor inside the inline HTML tag that has the footnote reference inside it. The footnote references should be included in their own superscript or font tag. If you look in the management view, you can make sure that the cursor is inside an inline tag. Click Footnotes and select the Add Reference to Row menu item. This will add the reference to the entire row. If the footnote applied to only a single value in a row, we would use another footnote option. Add footnote reference to the column would mark the entire column with a footnote. Add footnote reference to a fact cell would mark a specific cell. Next, we need to mark the footnote ID. To tag the footnote ID, it must be contained in its own HTML block. The best way to format footnotes so the ID is in its own block is to use the reflow as hanging function. Normally you would do this as part of your HTML formatting for your document, but I'm going to show you how to use this function now. Place the cursor inside the footnote text. Go to the paragraph ribbon. Click As Hanging. You can see table grid lines show up to indicate that this paragraph was converted to an HTML table. The footnote ID is now in its own cell. Depending on how the document was converted, for example from Word, hanging paragraphs may automatically be placed in tables. If they were, you can skip this function. To tag the ID with XDX, place the cursor in the cell with the ID. Then go to the XDX Markup ribbon. Click the Footnotes button and choose the Mark Footnote ID option. The n-gram will be added to the document. To mark the text for the footnote, place the cursor inside the cell that contains the footnote text. Click the Footnotes button and choose the Mark Text for Footnote option. The n-gram will be added to the document. As you can see, adding footnotes is quite simple. The most important thing to remember is that the footnote reference must be inside of its own tag. And after we tag all the footnotes for the table, the presentation is complete, and we can move on to the next financial statement, which follows the same process. And that concludes the simple financial statement tutorial. Thanks for watching.